A poor maid named Amara worked in the palace of a cruel king. The king had built a massive crocodile pit where he threw his enemies alive just to watch them suffer. One day, Amara accidentally spilled wine on the king's royal clothes, and in his fury, he ordered her to be thrown into the pit. Everyone thought her death was certain, but Amara's courage and quick thinking turned the tables. And in the end, it was the king himself who became prey to the crocodiles. Backhand index pointing right to know how this shocking twist unfolded. Watch the video till the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Palace of Olorin was a place of dazzling beauty and hidden nightmares. On the outside, its golden walls sparkled under the blazing Nigerian sun, casting reflections across the wide courtyards, where fountains shot up streams of clear water and gardens bloomed with hibiscus and bougainvillea. Merchants from faraway lands came here to admire its splendor. Soldiers in bright uniforms patrolled its grand gates, and ministers whispered in shadowed corridors about the king's power. But behind this shining facade, cruelty thrived. For the man who ruled Olorin, King ADEMOYE, was not remembered for kindness, nor for wisdom, but for the merciless way he crushed those who dared displease him. His punishments were not only severe, they were designed to instill fear so deep that no servant, soldier, or noble would even think of defying him. And his most dreaded creation was a crocodile pit, a dark trench dug at the edge of the palace gardens, filled with hungry reptiles whose massive jaws could snap bone in seconds. It was a theater of terror, a place where enemies met gruesome ends, while the king laughed and feasted above. Among the countless servants who worked in this gilded prison was a young woman named Amara. She was only 23, but life had already carved deep lines of hardship into her soul. Orphaned at a young age, she had no family to protect her, and poverty pushed her to seek work at the palace. Each dawn, she rose before the sun, tying a faded scarf over her braids and wrapping herself in a simple wrapper before hurrying to her duties. Her work was endless, sweeping long marble floors, polishing brass lamps until her hands ached, carrying heavy water jugs, and scrubbing the wine-stained robes of drunken nobles. Despite her exhaustion, Amara bore it all with quiet endurance, for she had no choice. The palace was cruel, but the streets outside were even crueler. She told herself that survival was victory, even if each day demanded the sacrifice of her pride. But Amara's quiet endurance did not shield her from the sharp eyes of the king. ADEMOYE, with his broad frame draped in heavy robes of velvet and gold, was a man who demanded absolute perfection. His face was sharp and proud, always twisted in an expression of superiority, and his booming voice silenced any protest. When he walked into a room, servants bent low, their foreheads nearly touching the ground, afraid to even breathe too loudly in his presence. Amara hated him in silence, as did many others, but hatred was a dangerous fire to carry in Olorin. One wrong glance, one misplaced word, one mistake too great, and that fire could burn the one who carried it. And mistakes in this palace were punished not with a whip or a dismissal, but with something far worse. Everyone whispered about the pit, though no one dared to speak too loudly of it. They had all heard the splashes, the screams that cut the night air, and the dreadful silence that followed. It was during one of the king's endless feasts that Amara's life took its fateful turn. The great hall was overflowing with music and laughter, drums beating in hypnotic rhythm, while dancers swayed their bodies before the nobles. Long tables sagged under the weight of roasted meats, spiced stews, yam pottages, and overflowing goblets of palm wine. The air was heavy with smoke and perfume, yet it reeked of excess. Amara was among the servants, scurrying from table to table, pouring wine into golden cups, wiping crumbs from embroidered cloths, and bending low every time the king glanced their way. Her hand shook slightly as she carried a tray with a tall jar of dark red wine, for she knew that one slip, one spill, could mean disaster. And then it happened. As Amara leaned forward to pour into the king's goblet, the jar slipped from her trembling hand. It was only for a second, but that second was enough. The heavy jar tipped. The stream of wine gushed out uncontrolled, and crimson liquid splashed across the king's embroidered robe. The hall froze. The drumming stopped mid-beat, dancers froze mid-step, and nobles gasped. The silence was suffocating. King ADEMOYE looked down at the stain spreading across his golden robe, and then he raised his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold fury. Amara dropped to her knees instantly, her forehead pressed to the floor, her lips trembling as she begged. "Forgive me, my king, forgive me, I beg you, it was not my intention." Her voice cracked, but there was no mercy in Ademoye's gaze. The cruel king rose from his throne, his towering shadow stretching across the hall. His robe dripped wine, looking like blood in the flickering torchlight. He did not shout. His voice was calm, too calm, and that made it worse. "You have stained not just my robe," he said slowly, "but my honor before my nobles, before my gods. What should be done with a careless servant who dares humiliate her king?" Whispers rippled through the hall. Some nobles looked away, unwilling to witness what they knew would come. Others smirked, eager for the spectacle. The servants all trembled, for they knew the answer before it was spoken. And then Ademoye declared, his lips curling into a cruel smile, "Throw her into the pit. Let the crocodiles taste her flesh." A murmur of shock filled the room, but no one dared challenge him. Guards rushed forward, seizing Amara by the arms. She screamed, pleaded, clung to the floor, her nails scraping against marble as she cried, "Please, my king, mercy! I beg you, mercy!" But mercy was a language King Ademoye had never learned. He watched as the guards dragged her out, his laughter booming across the silent hall. He raised his goblet, now refilled by another servant, and declared, "Tonight the pit shall feast." His words sent chills through every heart, yet none spoke. For to speak was to die. That night, as the torches flickered in the palace courtyard, Amara was dragged to the edge of the crocodile pit. The trench yawned before her like a dark mouth, and the sound of splashing water mixed with the hiss of massive reptiles below. Their eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and their jaws snapped hungrily, as if they knew what was coming. Amara's heart thundered in her chest, her tears streaming freely, her body trembling with terror. She prayed under her breath, whispered promises to gods she wasn't even sure were listening, anything that might spare her from the fate that awaited. And above her, standing on the platform, King Ademoye watched with a cruel smile, eager for the show about to begin. The morning after the dreadful night of suspicion and plotting began with the palace still wrapped in silence. Yet the air felt heavy with something unseen, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the cruelty of their master and now whispered back in echoes too faint for human ears. Amara, though her body was exhausted from endless chores and little sleep, forced herself to rise before the sun had fully broken the horizon. She knew her survival depended on discipline, on staying invisible, and on never allowing her emotions to betray her. But despite her effort to appear composed, her hands trembled slightly as she carried baskets of laundry across the courtyard. The whispers from the other servants followed her everywhere. "The king watches her too closely. Something will happen soon." She could feel their eyes darting toward her, some filled with pity, others with fear. Because in a palace ruled by tyranny, even sympathy could become a death sentence if the king suspected it. Amara clenched her jaw, pushing forward, but deep inside she could not silence the question pounding against her ribs. Why me? Why had fate chosen her to be the object of the king's twisted attention? By midday, the king emerged in the grand hall, dressed in flowing robes embroidered with golden patterns, his crown glinting with stones stolen from foreign lands. His expression carried the same unsettling arrogance that had made him both feared and despised. As he descended the steps, the hush among courtiers and guards deepened, their faces stiff with forced loyalty. Then his eyes landed on Amara, who had been sweeping near the pillars, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He beckoned her forward with the wave of his hand, the kind of wave one might use to summon a dog. Everyone in the hall froze, watching in a silence that cut like a blade, for they all knew what such a gesture meant. Amara was being singled out, and nothing good ever followed. Amara lowered her head and walked forward, every step feeling like an approach toward her own execution. When she reached him, the king tilted his head and studied her with cold amusement before speaking words that turned her blood to ice. "You think yourself pure, do you not? Untouched by fear? Today, I will prove otherwise. Prepare her for the pit." The hall gasped, a ripple of shock moving through servants and courtiers alike, for everyone knew what the pit meant. The pit, carved into the earth behind the palace walls, was a monstrous enclosure filled with crocodiles. creatures a king had collected from distant rivers and kept hungry for his own perverse entertainment. Many whispered that he had once thrown thieves, rebels, and even political rivals into the water, watching with delight as the crocodiles dragged him under. But never before had he announced such a punishment for a mere servant girl. Amara's heart raced as the guard seized her arms, their grip iron-tight though they themselves avoided her eyes, ashamed yet powerless. She did not fight, for she knew resistance would only worsen the cruelty. Instead, she whispered a silent prayer under her breath, a plea for strength, for clarity, for some miracle of survival. Around her, other servants lowered their gazes, unwilling to watch, unwilling to risk sharing her fate by showing compassion. And yet, as she was dragged to the corridors, Amara noticed something strange. Among the shadows, a few servants lingered longer than they should have, their eyes flickering with quiet defiance, as if her suffering was awakening something they themselves had long buried, rage against the king. By the time the guards led Amara into the courtyard where the pit lay, the afternoon sun had turned the world blindingly bright, its heat pressing down like judgment itself. The pit stretched wide and deep, its waters murky, rippling with the movement of massive crocodiles whose eyes glowed above the surface like emerald daggers. The sound of their low hisses carried across the courtyard, mixing with the thud of drums the king had ordered to be played, turning the moment into a twisted performance. The king stood at the edge of the pit, looking down with a grin that revealed his teeth, his crown gleaming as though mocking the suffering before him. Courtiers gathered in a semicircle, their faces massive of obedience, though many could barely hide their horror. "This," the king declared, raising his arms as if addressing the gods themselves, "is what awaits those who think they are above my will. Watch and learn." His voice boomed across the courtyard, and the crowd murmured in forced approval, though beneath the surface, unease spread like wildfire. The guard shoved Amara closer to the edge, the ground beneath her feet crumbling slightly as dust fell into the pit below. The crocodiles stirred, thrashing their tails, their hunger awakened by the scent of human fear. Amara's breath quickened, but instead of breaking down, she straightened her back, forcing herself to look forward, refusing to give the king the satisfaction of her terror. Her defiance unsettled him. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning sharper than ever. "Throw her in," he commanded. The words echoed like thunder, and the guards hesitated only briefly before dragging Amara toward the very brink. The world blurred around her. Faces of onlookers, the shimmer of sunlight on water, the snapping jaws below, all merging into a terrifying whirlpool. But in the center of that chaos, she found a strange stillness, as if something within her had accepted death but not defeat. She knew the king's cruelty might end her body, but she vowed in her heart that her spirit would outlast him. Just as the guard prepared to push her, an unexpected noise shattered the courtyard's tense silence, the shriek of a child. From the cluster of servants, a little girl no older than 10 had broken free from her mother's grip, running forward with tears streaming down her face. "Don't hurt her, please," the child screamed, her small voice carrying with a power that silenced even the drums. The crowd gasped, shocked by such boldness, while the mother clutched her chest in despair. The king's eyes darkened, fury flashing like lightning, for he despised interruptions, especially those that exposed his cruelty too plainly. He raised his hand, ready to order the child punished, but in that moment the tide of silence had shifted. Whispers spread rapidly through the crowd, their shame turning into murmurs of courage, as if the innocence of the child had awakened their long-suppressed humanity. The king, sensing the change, clenched his fist, unwilling to admit that control was slipping from his grasp. Amara, still standing at the edge of death, felt a sudden surge of hope, not for her own safety, but for the possibility that the king's cruelty was finally being seen for what it was, raw and undeniable. And so, with the sun glaring down and the crocodiles thrashing below, the moment stretched endlessly, suspended between the will of one tyrant and the rising courage of the many. Amara's fate still hung in the balance, yet something profound had shifted. The silence of the oppressed had cracked, and through that crack poured a light no cruelty could fully smother. The king, though still smiling, could not hide the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if deep down he sensed that his power, once absolute, had begun to tremble. The day of judgment finally arrived, and the palace was transformed into a theater of cruelty. The courtyard, usually reserved for royal ceremonies, was surrounded by thick wooden barriers, torches burning in every corner as if to celebrate an upcoming spectacle rather than mourn an inevitable tragedy. Villagers had gathered, whispers of disbelief moving among them like restless winds, yet no one dared to speak aloud against the king. In the center of the courtyard stood a massive iron gate that led to a deep pit dug by palace workers. At the bottom of that pit roared and hissed the king's most prized monsters, a dozen Nile crocodiles. Their massive bodies slid in and out of the muddy water, their rough, armor-like scales gleaming under the sun. Their wide jaws opened, displaying jagged teeth, and their tails thrashed with violence that shook the very wooden planks of the pit. To the villagers, it was a horrifying sight, but to the king it was entertainment. He stood on the high platform in golden robes, a mocking smile etched on his lips, while Amara, the poor maid whose only crime was her courage to speak the truth, was dragged forward by two guards, her wrists bound, her eyes red from sleepless nights but still burning with an inner fire that fear could not extinguish. As she was pushed forward, the crowd gasped, not because of the brutality they were about to witness, but because of the calmness on her face. Amara was not trembling the way the king expected her to. She was not begging or screaming. Instead, she walked with a dignity that made her torn dress and shackled wrists look like royal garments. Her eyes scanned the crowd, catching the sympathetic glances of the few villagers who still had humanity left in them. She recognized the servant boy Kalechi hiding in the shadows, his small fists clenched in helpless anger, and she saw Adeku, her fellow maid, quietly cry behind a line of guards, unable to even breathe at the horror about to unfold. Amara knew this might be her last day, yet she lifted her chin and locked her gaze on the king. That silent defiance, the refusal to break under his cruelty, irritated the monarch more than words ever could. He raised his hand, signaling the guards to prepare the execution, and the villagers fell silent, holding their breath as the moment drew near. The iron chains creaked as the gate of the crocodile pit was pulled open. The creatures stirred violently, as though they had sensed the promise of flesh. Their massive bodies writhed in the shallow water, their heads lifting to the surface, eyes like twin stones reflecting a hunger that had no mercy. The guards tightened their grip on Amara's arms, dragging her closer to the edge. One slip, and she would tumble into the pit where those ancient beasts waited. The king laughed, his deep, cruel voice echoing across the courtyard, and announced, "This is the fate of those who dare to challenge my word. Let this servant's death be a lesson to all of you. None are above the crown, not even the lowliest of maids." His words rolled like thunder, shaking the air, but Amara stood tall, refusing to bow her head. Instead, she spoke, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "No crown lasts forever. No cruelty stands the test of time. One day, the people you rule with fear will rise, and even your golden throne will crumble." The villagers gasped at her boldness, some covering their mouths in shock, others secretly feeling a surge of hope. The king's smile vanished, replaced by rage, and with a sharp motion of his hand, he ordered the guards to push her into the pit. Amara's body stumbled forward, and for a moment it seemed like the world slowed. Her bare feet scraped the edge of the platform, the sound of the crocodile's snarls echoing below like drums of death. The crowd cried out, some turning away, unable to watch. But then, in a desperate twist of instinct, Amara fell sideways instead of forward, collapsing on the hard ground, inches away from the pit's edge. The guards rushed to grab her, but in that moment, the rope that bound her wrists scraped against the rough edge of the wooden barrier and snapped. Her hands, though raw and bloodied, were free. She rolled quickly, grabbing a broken spear that had been left behind by one of the careless guards, and stood facing them, her chest heaving with breath, her face streaked with sweat and defiance. The crowd erupted in murmurs, for the maid who was supposed to be a helpless sacrifice now stood like a warrior cornered but unbroken. The king's eyes widened in fury. He shouted for the guards to seize her, but hesitation filled the men, not because they feared Amara, but because for the first time they questioned the justice of what they were doing. They had always seen her work quietly, serving without complaint, enduring humiliation with silence. But now, seeing her with a weapon in her hand, facing certain death without fear, something shifted in their hearts. A few villagers even shouted encouragement, though quickly silenced by the soldiers stationed at the corners. Amara knew she could not fight an army, but she also knew she could not give the king the satisfaction of watching her beg. She pointed the broken spear at the crocodile pit and shouted, "If death is to be my fate, then let it be by my own choice, not by the hand of a tyrant." With that, she lifted her body and leaped toward the pit's edge, not as a victim, but as someone determined to write her own ending. The king gasped, thinking she had lost her mind, but what happened next shook the entire courtyard. Instead of falling straight into the jaws of the crocodiles, Amara landed on one of the heavy chains that hung across the pit, used by keepers to lower carcasses of animals for feeding. She clung to it desperately, swinging above the snapping jaws of the reptiles below. The creatures lunged, their tails thrashing in the water, but she pulled herself upward, her muscles straining, determination written across her face. The crowd screamed, some in horror, others in awe, as the guards scrambled to catch her. But before they could, she swung herself toward the wooden barrier and landed on the far side of the pit, bruised but alive. Dust rose around her as she stood, weapon still in hand, her hair tangled but her eyes sharper than ever. The king's fury was uncontrollable now. He screamed at his guards, demanding that they surround her and drag her back. Yet for the first time, doubt crept into the soldiers' movements. They hesitated, their steps slow, their eyes flicking between the king and the girl who had just defied death itself. The villagers murmured louder now, some daring to clap their hands, others shouting her name. "Amara, Amara." The chant began softly, but soon it grew, rising like a wave, filling the courtyard with a power greater than fear. The king turned pale, realizing that the people's loyalty was slipping away, not toward him, but toward the very servant he had tried to destroy. Amara raised a broken spear high above her head, her voice thundering louder than the king's ever could. "You can throw me to your monsters, but I will not bow. I will not break. And neither should any of you." The courtyard erupted, the people rising with energy that had long been buried under oppression. Guards exchanged uncertain glances, some lowering their weapons altogether. The king, once untouchable in his power, now stood alone on his golden platform, watching as a maid he condemned to die ignited a fire in the hearts of his people. And in that single moment, though Amara was bruised, bloodied, and still surrounded by danger, she became something more than just a servant. She became the symbol of defiance, the voice of the oppressed, and the nightmare of a tyrant who thought he was invincible. The morning after the crocodile pit trial, the palace was a storm without rain. Whispers ran through its marble corridors like wildfire in the dry harmattan winds. Every servant, every guard, every cook and handmaid carrying the same tale on trembling lips, how Amara, the lowly maid, had defied death itself. She had not been ripped apart by the king's monstrous crocodiles. Instead, through wit, grit, and an unshakable will to live, she had escaped their gaping jaws. The cruel king, Oba Adewale, had not expected such defiance. He had wanted the spectacle of her screaming, her bones breaking under reptilian force, her blood spilling in front of all who watched as proof of his godlike power. Instead, he had been mocked by fate. The crowd had not forgotten what they saw. Some feared speaking aloud, yet in hushed tones behind closed doors, they whispered that perhaps the gods were with Amara, that perhaps she was no ordinary maid but a chosen one destined to rise against tyranny. Such whispers, carried by the invisible wind, crawled their way to the king himself, poisoning his pride like venom in his veins. Oba Adewale stood by the great window of his private chamber, his robes of royal purple dragging heavily across the polished floor, his chest rising and falling with a dangerous rhythm. The golden staff in his hand trembled slightly as he tightened his grip. His eyes, dark and burning, stared out into the courtyard below, where Amara was seen walking again among the servants. There was no fear in her step, no shame on her face, only a quiet dignity that had begun to inspire others. The guards who once laughed at her now looked away when she passed. The maids who had once pitied her now secretly admired her. The king could not tolerate this shift. To him, power was not about justice but domination. The thought that a poor maid could shake the foundation of his authority boiled his blood. If fear does not hold them, then what will? he muttered under his breath, pacing back and forth like a predator trapped in his own fury. His mind, diseased with arrogance, began plotting not just Amara's death, but her utter humiliation, something that would silence the whispers forever. That evening, the king summoned his most loyal advisor, Chief Balogun, an old man with a scarred face and sharp eyes. Balogun entered the chamber quietly, bowing deeply before his ruler, though even he carried the weight of hesitation in his chest. The king did not waste time with pleasantries. She must die, Oba Adewale hissed, his words like venom dripping from a fanged mouth. But not as before. The pit of crocodiles failed me. It made her a symbol. This time, her end must strip her of any dignity. This time, when the people look upon her, they must see not courage but failure. Balogun swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had seen the power of shifting loyalty among the people. He knew that striking down Amara wrongly could turn whispers into open rebellion. Still, he nodded, masking his thoughts. My king, the crowd awaits a new spectacle. Perhaps we must create a trial so impossible, so humiliating, that when she falls, none will doubt your greatness. The king's lips curled into a cruel smile, the kind that stretched too far to be human. Yes, he said softly. This time, I will bury her in shame. Meanwhile, Amara herself was caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. She had survived the jaws of death, yet she knew survival alone was not victory. The king's eyes followed her like a hawk. Every step she took in the palace gardens, every sip of water she drew from the well, every glance she exchanged with another servant was observed, weighed, and twisted by those loyal to him. She felt the danger growing closer, the air thick with threats she could not yet see. Still, she refused to hide. Each morning, she rose with the first light of the sun, her callous hands carrying out her duties with quiet strength. Yet in the silence of night, lying on the thin mat in the servants' quarters, her heart trembled with fear she could not voice. She thought of her late mother, whose dying words had been a warning. Amara, the world will not give you kindness, but you must never surrender your soul. Those words became her anchor. Still, a question haunted her. How long could she stand before the storm broke again? Days passed, and tension built like the tightening of a drum. Then, without warning, a new decree was announced. The king, in his booming voice, declared another public trial for Amara. The entire palace was commanded to gather in the great courtyard. Drums rolled through the night, summoning not only the palace dwellers, but even the townspeople beyond the gates, who smelled blood in the air and came eager for the spectacle. The servants, many of whom secretly prayed for Amara's survival, exchanged worried glances but dared not speak. Amara herself was dragged into the open, her wrists bound once more, her hair tangled from restless nights, yet her eyes shone with an unbreakable defiance. The crowd murmured at the sight of her. She did not look broken. She looked alive, and that very sight unnerved even those who had come only to mock her. The king rose upon the balcony, adorned in gold jewelry that glittered beneath the blazing sun. His voice thundered across the courtyard. Each word meant to crush her spirit and re-establish his dominion. This may defy the jaws of my crocodiles. Some of you, in your foolishness, believe this to be a sign of her strength. But today, I shall show you all the truth, that she is weak, that she is nothing, and that those who defy me will meet a fate worse than death. The crowd roared, some in fear, some in excitement, but all eyes fixed on Amara, who stood at the center of the courtyard like a lone tree against a storm. The king then raised his staff and declared the challenge. Amara would be forced to walk a narrow wooden bridge suspended directly above the crocodile pit. But this time, the bridge would be smeared with oil, slick, and nearly impossible to cross. If she falls, the king shouted, the beasts will finish what they started. And when they do, her courage will be forgotten, her name erased. A silence followed, heavy and suffocating. The servants trembled, unable to look away. The townspeople leaned forward in grim anticipation. Amara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum of war. She knew this was no test of skill. It was a trap designed for her death. Yet something within her refused to bow. She lifted her chin, her voice clear and steady as she answered the king. You may strip me of food, bind my hands, or throw me to beasts, but you will never strip me of my will. I am not afraid of your trial." Her words cut through the air like lightning, and for a brief moment, the crowd erupted in murmurs, their faith wavering. The king's face twisted in rage, his grip on the golden staff tightening. "Then let it begin," he spat, his eyes gleaming with hatred. And so the platform was set, the bridge gleaming slick with oil under the afternoon sun, the crocodiles below snapping their massive jaws in hunger. The crowd surged forward, breaths held, as Amara was forced to step onto the fragile planks. Each step could mean death. Each moment could mean freedom. And the fate of not only her life, but the spirit of the oppressed hung in the balance. The storm had reached its peak, and all that remained was whether Amara's who could weather the fury of the king's cruelty. The dawn crept into the palace like a thief, slipping light through the tall wooden shutters of the king's chamber. But that light did not bring hope. It only revealed the cracks in the throne of a ruler who thought himself untouchable. The whispers had spread through the kingdom faster than wildfire. The Maid Amara survived the crocodiles. No one in the village, no one in the court, not even the palace guards who had watched her dragged to the pit, could understand how she had walked out alive. It wasn't magic, nor some divine miracle. It was her wits, her courage, and the sheer willpower of a girl who had been broken so many times by the king's cruelty that fear itself had abandoned her. But to the common people, it was a sign that the king was not invincible, a sign that cruelty could be defied. And with every passing hour, the story grew larger, retold by farmers at the market, soldiers in hushed voices, mothers at the riverbank. The palace was trembling, not because its walls were weak, but because the truth had finally found a voice, and the king, in all his pride, could not silence it. When the king sat on his throne that morning, draped in his heavy golden robe, he felt an unease he had never known before. The laughter that once thundered in his chest when he watched servants tremble was gone. His hands, usually steady, drummed against the throne's armrest as though seeking reassurance from the carved wood. Amara had not only survived, she had returned to the palace courtyard to confront him, her clothes torn, her body bruised, but her eyes sharper than the edge of any sword. She had stood there, refusing to kneel, her voice rising in front of the guards, in front of the nobles, in front of the very people who had always seen her as nothing. She told them what the king had done, how he had tried to end her life in the pit of crocodiles, and how his cruelty stretched far beyond her. She reminded them of their own pain, of their brothers sent to mines, of their daughters taken into the palace kitchens, of their fathers whipped for speaking the truth. Her words were not polished or grand, but they were heavy with honesty, and each syllable landed like a stone against the fragile glass of the king's power. The king had expected laughter from his court when Amara spoke. He had expected his nobles to mock her, to call her a liar, to side with him as they always had. But instead, silence hung in the air like a thick fog. Eyes that once worshipped him now shifted uneasily. Guards who once obeyed his every cruel command hesitated, their hands twitching on their spears but not moving forward. And in that silence, the king felt something he had never felt before, the weight of being alone. For years, fear had been his shield, the tool that bent men to his will. But now, with one girl's defiance, that shield was cracked, and he saw in their faces that fear was turning into anger. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the palace had seen. The king rose from his throne, his voice booming, ordering her seized, declaring her a witch, a liar, a traitor to the crown. Yet his words no longer carried the same power. They were desperate, trembling, soaked with the sweat of a man who realized control was slipping through his fingers. Amara did not flinch. She did not beg. Instead, she stepped forward, lifted her torn sleeve to reveal the marks on her skin from the crocodile pit, and spoke directly to the guards. "If he can do this to me, what would he do to your daughters tomorrow?" It was not a threat, not a plea. It was a truth, spoken plainly, and it struck deeper than any weapon. And then came the turning point. One of the younger guards, no more than 20, dropped his spear to the ground. The sound of it hitting the stone echoed like thunder in the silent courtyard. Another followed, then another, until the ground clattered with iron. The king shouted, cursed, promised gold, promised power, but his voice was drowned out by the rising murmur of the people gathered at the gates. For the first time, the palace was not as alone, It belonged to them, to those who had suffered, to those who had waited for anyone, to spark the flame of resistance. And that flame was Amara. In a desperate rage, the king drew his sword and stepped down from the throne, his eyes wild and bloodshot, fixed on Amara with the fury of a cornered beast. "If no one will punish you," he hissed, "I will do it myself." The court gasped, the guards froze, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. But Amara did not step back. She picked up one of the fallen spears, her hand shaking but her grip steady, and faced him. It was not the weapon that gave her strength. It was the hundreds of eyes watching, the silent prayers of the people, the weight of justice that had long been denied. The fight was short, brutal, and shocking. The king, arrogant and unprepared, swung wildly, his rage blinding him. Amara, though weaker, fought with precision born of survival, dodging, enduring, striking when she could. And then, with one final desperate push, she drove the spear into his chest. The palace that had once echoed with his laughter now rang with his scream, and as he collapsed onto the cold marble floor, silence fell again. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a people realizing the tyrant was gone. The nobles whispered. The guards stepped back. The people outside the gates pressed forward. Amara stood there, panting, her body trembling, the spear slipping from her hand. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She only stood, knowing that the world had shifted, that her survival had become more than just her story. It had become theirs. By sunset, word had traveled beyond the palace walls, beyond the village, beyond the rivers that marked the kingdom's borders. The king who fed his servants to crocodiles was dead, brought down not by armies or rival kings, but by a girl no one had thought mattered. The people buried him without ceremony, his golden crown discarded, his throne left empty. Amara, though hailed as a hero, did not claim the throne. She returned to the village, to the fields, to the life she had always known, because her victory was not about power. It was about proving that cruelty could be defeated. And as night fell, the palace glowed with torchlight, not of fear but of celebration. Children laughed, women sang, men clapped their hands to the rhythm of freedom. Amara watched from a distance, the weight of her journey heavy in her chest, but her eyes lifted to the sky, knowing her story would live on long after her. For every servant still bent under cruelty, for every voice still silenced, her defiance had lit a spark. And to you, watching the story unfold, remember Amara's fight, remember her courage, and remember this: no cruelty lasts forever. Justice may come slowly, but it always comes. If you believe in her strength, if you believe in her fight, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that will leave you speechless. Your support keeps these stories alive.